The crimson sun descended behind the coral islands of the Pacific on March 9, 1945. Across the vast expanse of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, the thunderous roar of Wright R-3350 engines reverberated through the tropical evening air. On concrete runways that stretched for miles across what had once been Japanese-held territory, an unprecedented armada was preparing for departure. The very air seemed to vibrate with anticipation as ground crews swarmed around massive aircraft, their movements precise and purposeful, despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. 334 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers sat like silver giants against the darkening sky, their four engine configurations representing the pinnacle of American aerospace engineering and industrial might. Each aircraft bore the distinctive markings of the 20th Air Force, their polished aluminum fuselages reflecting the dying light of day in a display that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But this evening was fundamentally different from any other in the Pacific theater of World War II, carrying with it implications that would resonate through history. Inside the cavernous bomb bays of these aircraft, ordnance specialists were methodically loading something revolutionary: cluster bombs packed with experimental incendiary devices that would forever change the nature of strategic warfare. Each E-46 cluster bomb contained 38 individual M69 bomblets, hexagonal tubes filled with a new substance called napalm that burned at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The systematic loading process represented months of planning, research, and tactical innovation that was about to be tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The target for this massive operation lay 1,500 miles to the northwest, the densely populated residential districts of Tokyo, Japan's imperial capital, where over 1 million civilians lived in wooden structures packed into an area smaller than Manhattan. This was not a military installation or industrial complex in the traditional sense, but rather the beating heart of Japanese civilization, where families had lived for generations in neighborhoods that embodied centuries of cultural development and social organization. Major General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command from his headquarters on Guam, had authorized the most radical tactical transformation in the history of strategic bombing. The 38-year-old general had built his reputation through innovative bombing operations over Europe, but the challenges of the Pacific theater demanded completely new approaches that would test every assumption about air warfare. His decision to fundamentally alter American bombing doctrine represented a calculated risk that could either achieve decisive strategic results or result in catastrophic failure. At 17:35 hours local time, the first B-29 lifted off from Northfield, Guam, its four Wright Cyclone engines straining against the unusual weight distribution caused by maximum incendiary loads and reduced defensive armament. Behind it, at precisely calculated 50-second intervals, bomber after bomber followed suit, their engines adding to a crescendo of sound that announced the beginning of what would become the single most destructive bombing raid in human history. The careful timing reflected months of logistical planning, designed to deliver maximum destructive force while minimizing the vulnerabilities associated with mass formations. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the absolute pinnacle of 1945 aviation technology and American industrial capability, embodying innovations that had never before been combined in a single aircraft design. No aircraft in human history had demanded such extensive resources, engineering expertise, or manufacturing coordination to bring from concept to operational reality. The development program required over 1.4 million engineering man-hours and consumed $3 billion in funding, surpassing even the Manhattan Project's $2 billion budget and representing a larger investment than many nations' entire wartime expenditures. Manufacturing the Superfortress demanded unprecedented industrial collaboration across the American continent, requiring coordination between dozens of suppliers, subcontractors, and primary manufacturers. The primary production line operated at Boeing's Seattle facility, where engineers had designed revolutionary production techniques specifically adapted to the complexity of this advanced aircraft. Additional manufacturing occurred at Boeing's Renton and Wichita plants, while the Glenn L. Martin Company contributed production capacity at their Omaha facility, and Bell Aircraft Corporation's Marietta, Georgia plant provided supplementary manufacturing capabilities. Each completed B-29 measured 99 feet in length, with a wingspan extending 141 feet and 3 inches, dimensions that allowed for internal volume sufficient to accommodate advanced systems while maintaining aerodynamic efficiency. The aircraft's 4 Wright R 3350 duplex Cyclone engines generated 2,200 horsepower each, providing sufficient power to lift maximum takeoff weights exceeding 133,000 pounds, while maintaining operational effectiveness at extreme altitudes and ranges. The power plant configuration enabled operational ceilings up to 33,600 feet, with maximum speeds reaching 357 miles per hour under optimal conditions, performance figures that exceeded those of virtually all contemporary aircraft. These capabilities allowed the Superfortress to operate above the effective range of most enemy fighters and anti-aircraft weapons, while maintaining the speed necessary to evade interception attempts. The bomber's revolutionary design incorporated numerous technological innovations that distinguished it from all previous aircraft and established new standards for military aviation. Pressurized crew compartments allowed operations at extreme altitudes without requiring crew members to wear bulky oxygen equipment throughout missions that could last 14 hours or more. This innovation directly translated to improved crew performance and reduced fatigue during extended operations over vast Pacific distances. Remote-controlled gun turrets eliminated the need for gunners to occupy exposed positions while providing superior defensive coordination through centralized fire control systems. Advanced navigation equipment included the latest LoRaN radio systems, enabling precise position determination across thousands of miles of open ocean where traditional navigation methods proved inadequate. Weather radar provided crew members with information about storm systems that could affect mission success or aircraft safety during long overwater flights. Internal bomb bays could accommodate up to 20,000 pounds of ordnance over combat radiuses exceeding 1,600 miles, providing unprecedented striking capability at distances that had previously been impossible to achieve. Multiple bomb bay configurations allowed crews to carry various combinations of high-explosive, incendiary, or specialized munitions depending on specific mission requirements, while advanced bomb release mechanisms provided precise timing control essential for coordinated area attacks. By March 1945, American factories had delivered approximately 2,000 completed B-29s to combat units, with production accelerating toward the eventual wartime total of 3,970 aircraft. Boeing's Wichita plant alone achieved production rates of 4.2 completed aircraft per working day, a manufacturing tempo that exceeded entire nations' annual aircraft output and demonstrated American industrial capabilities on an unprecedented scale. The 20th Air Force, commanded personally by General Henry Harley "Hap" Arnold from Washington, represented a revolutionary approach to strategic air power employment that bypassed traditional theater command structures. Unlike previous bombing commands that operated under regional theater commanders, the 20th Air Force reported directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, ensuring centralized strategic direction while providing unprecedented resource allocation authority. This command structure eliminated coordination difficulties that had plagued earlier bombing campaigns, while concentrating decision-making at the highest levels of military leadership. Operating from the recently captured Mariana Islands, the 21st Bomber Command could deploy over 300 B-29s for single missions, supported by an extensive infrastructure designed specifically for Superfortress operations. The 73rd Bombardment Wing and 313th Bombardment Wing operated from Saipan's multiple airfields, while the 314th Bombardment Wing utilized Guam's extensive facilities. Each base featured multiple parallel runways constructed specifically for Superfortress operations, along with specialized maintenance facilities, ammunition storage areas, and crew accommodations designed to support sustained high-tempo operations. Ground support capabilities matched the aircraft's technological sophistication through specialized maintenance crews, working around-the-clock schedules to maintain operational readiness rates exceeding 70%. Remarkable figures for such complex aircraft operating in tropical conditions, thousands of miles from primary manufacturing facilities. Parts supply chains extended directly from American factories to forward bases via dedicated cargo aircraft and naval transport vessels, ensuring that mechanical problems could be resolved quickly without compromising mission schedules. Combat crew training reflected the aircraft's complexity and operational importance through programs requiring over 200 hours of specialized instruction before pilots qualified for combat operations. This extensive training covered pressurization systems, engine management, navigation procedures, formation flying, and emergency protocols specific to B-29 operations. Bombardiers received extensive instruction in the sophisticated Norden bombsight system and emerging radar bombing techniques that would prove crucial for operations in poor weather conditions. Imperial Japan's air defense system by March 1945 presented a comprehensive study in technological obsolescence, organizational dysfunction, and resource depletion that stood in stark contrast to American capabilities. The island nation's defensive preparations, developed during years of military expansion and early wartime success, had proven wholly inadequate against the scale and sophistication of American strategic bombing operations that had begun reaching Japanese territory with increasing frequency and effectiveness. The fundamental structural weakness of Japanese air defense lay in the complete separation between Imperial Army and Imperial Navy aviation commands, services that operated entirely independent command structures with minimal coordination or communication between their respective headquarters. This division reflected broader inter-service rivalries that had plagued Japanese military operations throughout the war, creating enormous gaps in defensive coverage and preventing unified response to coordinated enemy attacks that required seamless integration of all available defensive assets. Army aviation focused primarily on supporting ground operations and defending Army installations, while naval aviation concentrated on fleet support and maritime patrol duties that had become increasingly difficult to maintain as American forces advanced closer to the Japanese home islands. This organizational separation meant that defensive planning occurred independently within each service, with little consideration for how Army and Navy assets might be combined to create more effective defensive coverage against strategic bombing threats. Japan's primary night fighter aircraft, the Nakajima J-1N Gecko, or Moonlight, exemplified the nation's technological limitations and the desperate improvisation that characterized Japanese military equipment by the war's final phases. Originally designed as a reconnaissance aircraft for long-range patrol missions, the Gecko had been hastily converted for night fighting duties through the installation of twin 20mm Type 99 cannons configured to fire upward at 30-degree angles, along with another pair firing downward at similar angles. This unusual armament arrangement theoretically allowed attacks from unexpected angles that might surprise bomber crews and achieve better results than conventional forward-firing weapons. But practical implementation proved extremely difficult under actual combat conditions. The modifications had never been properly integrated into the original design, creating maintenance problems and reducing overall aircraft performance while providing only marginal improvements in combat effectiveness. Total Gecko production throughout the entire war reached only 479 aircraft, with significant numbers already lost to combat, accidents, and mechanical failures by early 1945. Most remaining aircraft suffered from severe parts shortages that limited operational readiness rates to approximately 30%, meaning that fewer than 150 Gecko aircraft were available for defensive operations across all of Japan. Maintenance problems were exacerbated by the complexity of night-fighting modifications that required specialized knowledge and equipment that was increasingly unavailable. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, or Dragon Killer, provided additional night fighter capability through a different approach that mounted a 37mm cannon in the nose and oblique-firing 20mm cannons in side positions. However, only 1,711 Toryu aircraft had been manufactured since 1941, with fewer than 200 remaining operational by March 1945 due to combat losses, mechanical failures, and parts shortages that affected all Japanese aircraft types. Like the Gecko, the Toryu suffered from inadequate radar equipment and limited night flying capabilities that severely restricted its effectiveness against high-altitude bombers operating under cover of darkness. Japanese radar technology lagged significantly behind American and British systems, lacking the range, accuracy, and reliability necessary for effective night interception operations. Most critically, Japanese night fighters lacked airborne radar systems for target detection and interception, forcing pilots to depend entirely on ground-based searchlights and visual identification methods that proved nearly useless against fast-moving bombers operating in darkness at high altitudes. Searchlight coordination was primitive, with individual units operating independently without centralized control or standardized procedures. Most searchlights lacked sufficient range and intensity to effectively illuminate targets at the altitudes typically used by B-29 formations, making visual identification extremely difficult even under optimal conditions. Ground-based anti-aircraft defenses were similarly inadequate for defending against mass bomber attacks of the scale that American forces could now mount against Japanese targets. The entire Tokyo metropolitan area possessed fewer than 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns of all types, a defensive density that would have been considered minimal for protecting a single major industrial facility in Germany or Britain. This shortage reflected both Japan's limited industrial capacity for producing complex weapon systems and the competing demands of field armies that required artillery support in combat zones throughout the Pacific. The primary heavy anti-aircraft weapon, the Type 88mm gun, provided reasonable high-altitude capability when properly employed, but existed in numbers too small to create effective defensive barriers around critical targets. These weapons required trained crews, sophisticated fire control systems, and adequate ammunition supplies, all of which were in critically short supply by March 1945. The Type 98 20mm cannon offered close-range protection with effective ceilings reaching only 11,500 feet, making them potentially useful against low-flying attackers, but lacking the range to create substantial defensive zones around critical targets. More importantly, ammunition supplies for all anti-aircraft weapons had become severely limited due to resource shortages and priority allocation to field armies fighting desperate defensive actions across the Pacific. Fire control systems for anti-aircraft artillery remained primitive compared to Allied standards, reflecting Japan's technological limitations and reduced industrial capacity for producing sophisticated equipment. Japanese gunners relied primarily on optical rangefinders and sound locators that became completely ineffective during poor weather conditions or night operations, when visibility was limited and acoustic detection was disrupted by wind and engine noise. The lack of radar-controlled fire direction meant that accurate engagement of high-speed targets was essentially impossible, reducing anti-aircraft effectiveness to random area fire that rarely achieved meaningful results against formations of aircraft. This technological disadvantage was compounded by ammunition shortages that forced gun crews to conserve rounds, limiting training opportunities and reducing crew proficiency at a time when maximum effectiveness was most needed. Ammunition production for air defense purposes had declined precipitously as Japan's industrial capacity became increasingly strained by the demands of supporting multiple combat theaters while dealing with resource shortages and transportation difficulties. High-explosive shells for anti-aircraft guns required sophisticated fusing mechanisms and quality steel that were in critically short supply, forcing manufacturers to reduce production or compromise quality standards that affected weapon effectiveness. Many anti-aircraft positions were reduced to rationing ammunition to preserve supplies for major attacks, a policy that limited training opportunities and reduced crew proficiency, just when enemy bombing operations were increasing in frequency and intensity. This created a downward spiral in which reduced training led to poor performance, which in turn justified further ammunition restrictions that made the problem progressively worse. Personnel shortages affected all aspects of air defense operations as experienced military personnel were transferred to support more pressing combat requirements. Experienced pilots who might have provided effective night fighter coverage had been assigned to kamikaze units or dispersed among various frontline commands throughout the Pacific Theater, where immediate tactical needs took precedence over strategic defensive requirements. Replacement pilots received minimal night flying instruction due to fuel shortages and the pressing need to maintain daylight operations against Allied naval forces that were advancing steadily toward the Japanese home islands. Even experienced pilots had limited recent flight time, reducing their effectiveness in combat situations that required split-second decisions and precise aircraft handling under extremely challenging conditions. Anti-aircraft gun crews similarly suffered from personnel depletion, as experienced operators were transferred to field artillery units, supporting ground combat operations in various Pacific theaters. Replacement crews received abbreviated training on complex fire control procedures, significantly reducing the probability of successful target engagement when coordination and precision were most critical. Many gun positions operated with reduced crews that could not maintain optimal firing rates during sustained attacks, further reducing the already limited effectiveness of Japanese anti-aircraft defenses. Communication systems linking various defensive elements had deteriorated due to equipment failures and maintenance difficulties that reflected broader problems with Japanese military infrastructure. Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command on January 20, 1945, inheriting a strategic bombing campaign that had consistently failed to achieve decisive results despite enormous resource expenditure and technological superiority. The 38-year-old general brought with him an impressive reputation for tactical innovation and ruthless efficiency gained during successful bombing operations over Europe. But the unique challenges awaiting him in the Pacific Theater demanded completely new approaches to strategic air warfare that would test every assumption about bombing effectiveness. Previous high-altitude precision bombing operations conducted according to established Army Air Force doctrine had proven consistently ineffective against Japanese targets, with B-29 formations flying at altitudes between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, encountering atmospheric conditions that scattered their ordnance far from intended impact points. These disappointing results occurred despite the sophisticated Norden bombsight system and extensive crew training in precision bombing techniques that had proven successful in European operations. The recently discovered jet stream, a high-altitude wind current that could reach velocities exceeding 250 miles per hour, pushed bombs miles off target, despite sophisticated bombsight calculations and careful attention to wind correction procedures. This phenomenon was poorly understood at the time, creating unpredictable bombing conditions that made accurate target engagement nearly impossible, even when visibility conditions were optimal. Weather conditions over Japan compounded targeting difficulties significantly, with cloud cover obscuring targets during approximately 70% of all missions scheduled against Japanese industrial facilities. When bombardiers could not visually identify their objectives through the sophisticated Norden bombsight system, they were forced to rely on primitive radar bombing techniques that provided insufficient resolution for accurate engagement of specific installations. The result was a bombing campaign that consumed enormous resources while achieving minimal strategic impact against Japanese war production capabilities, a situation that was becoming increasingly unacceptable as pressure mounted for decisive action that would bring the Pacific War to a rapid conclusion. Mechanical problems with B-29 aircraft increased dramatically when operating at extreme altitudes with maximum bomb loads, creating additional complications that reduced mission effectiveness. The Wright R-3350 engines, pushed beyond their design limitations by the demands of climbing to operational altitude while carrying heavy ordnance loads, experienced frequent failures due to overheating magnesium alloy components that had been selected for weight savings, but proved inadequate under extreme operating conditions. Many bombers were forced to abort missions or make emergency landings due to engine problems, reducing the effective striking power of each carefully planned operation. Navigation difficulties over the vast Pacific Ocean were exacerbated by weather conditions and radio interference that disrupted electronic navigation aids, creating additional challenges for crews attempting to locate targets thousands of miles from their home bases. Crews frequently became lost during long overwater flights, consuming excessive fuel while searching for their targets or return routes, with some aircraft running out of fuel before reaching their bases despite successful mission completion. LeMay analyzed these operational problems with the systematic approach that had characterized his successful European command, directing his staff to conduct detailed studies of bombing accuracy, weather patterns, mechanical failure rates, and defensive effectiveness to identify the fundamental causes of poor mission results. These comprehensive analyses revealed that conventional strategic bombing doctrine, developed specifically for European conditions and targets, was simply inappropriate for Pacific theater operations against Japanese industrial and military installations. The critical breakthrough came when LeMay recognized that Japanese urban construction presented unique opportunities for different types of attack that could achieve strategic objectives more effectively than precision bombing of individual installations. Intelligence reports indicated that much of Japan's war production occurred in small workshops, dispersed throughout residential areas, rather than concentrated in large, easily identifiable factories that could be targeted through conventional precision bombing techniques. These shadow factories could only be eliminated through area attacks that destroyed entire neighborhoods, a tactical approach that differed fundamentally from established bombing doctrine, but offered the potential for achieving decisive strategic results. Japanese building construction, utilizing primarily wooden frames with paper screens and tile roofing, created conditions that were ideally suited for incendiary attacks that could create rapidly spreading fires. LeMay's tactical revolution involved abandoning virtually every principle of conventional strategic bombing doctrine that had been developed through years of experience in European operations. Instead of high-altitude daylight attacks conducted in tight defensive formations, his bombers would approach their targets individually at night from altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, eliminating many of the problems that had plagued high-altitude operations. Instead of high-explosive bombs aimed at specific installations, they would carry maximum loads of incendiary devices specifically designed to create widespread urban fires that would destroy both residential areas and the small workshops integrated within them. Most controversially, defensive armament would be removed from attacking aircraft to double their bomb-carrying capacity from 3.5 to 7 tons of incendiary weapons, a modification that represented a calculated risk based on intelligence assessments of Japanese defensive capabilities. Operation Meetinghouse represented a comprehensive reimagining of strategic bombing doctrine that abandoned conventional approaches in favor of revolutionary tactics specifically designed to exploit Japanese vulnerabilities while maximizing American technological advantages. The operations planning phase involved unprecedented cooperation between military strategists, intelligence analysts, weapons specialists, and meteorologists to create an integrated attack system capable of achieving decisive strategic results that had eluded previous conventional bombing efforts. Target selection for the operation focused on a precisely defined rectangular area in northeastern Tokyo, measuring approximately 3 miles by 4 miles, encompassing the Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa wards that collectively formed the Shitamachi district. This zone contained the highest concentration of small manufacturing facilities integrated within residential neighborhoods, where approximately 750,000 civilians lived in one of the densest population concentrations anywhere on Earth. American planners had utilized detailed pre-war Japanese urban planning documents, insurance company fire risk assessments, and architectural surveys conducted by intelligence agencies to identify neighborhoods with maximum vulnerability to incendiary attacks. The selected area featured predominantly wooden construction with narrow streets that would impede firefighting efforts, limited water supplies that could not support large-scale fire suppression operations, and minimal professional firefighting capabilities that would be quickly overwhelmed by simultaneous fires across a wide area. Wind patterns during March typically created conditions that would accelerate fire propagation throughout the target zone, while weather forecasts predicted clear skies and low humidity that would further enhance incendiary effectiveness. The shadow factory concept provided strategic justification for area attacks against primarily residential neighborhoods, as thousands of small workshops throughout the district produced aircraft components, precision instruments, electrical equipment, and mechanical parts essential to Japan's continuing war effort. Weapon selection centered on the M69 incendiary bomblet, a revolutionary munition that had been developed specifically for attacking wooden urban construction through extensive testing and refinement. Each hexagonal steel cylinder measured 3 inches in diameter and 20 inches in length, weighing 6 pounds when loaded with napalm gel that had been formulated to provide optimal burning characteristics against Japanese building materials. Unlike earlier incendiary designs that burned at extreme temperatures but could be extinguished with water or sand, the M69 used gelid gasoline that adhered to surfaces and resisted conventional firefighting efforts. This innovation represented a significant advance in incendiary weapon technology that had been achieved through collaboration between military researchers and civilian chemical companies. The M69's technical specifications reflected extensive research into optimal incendiary effects conducted at testing facilities using replica Japanese construction. Each bomblet deployed a cotton streamer during descent to orient its fuse mechanism downward, ensuring proper detonation regardless of impact angle or surface conditions. A time delay fuse burned for 3 to 5 seconds before triggering a white phosphorus charge that ignited the napalm contents, dispersing flaming gel up to 100 feet in multiple directions, with sufficient force to penetrate interior spaces through windows, doors, and other openings. 24-year-old Yoshiko Hashimoto sat in her modest wooden home in Tokyo's Sumida ward on the evening of March 9, 1945, gently rocking her 13-month-old son Hiroshi, while preparing for what she expected would be another routine night during a war that had increasingly affected civilian life throughout Japan. Her husband Kenji, a dedicated officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, was performing guard duty at military headquarters across the city, leaving Yoshiko to care for their infant son alongside her elderly parents and younger sister Etsuko, in circumstances that had become increasingly challenging as the war progressed. The Hashimoto family home, like virtually every residence in the densely populated Shitamachi district, embodied traditional Japanese construction methods that had evolved over centuries to accommodate local climate conditions and available materials. The structure featured wooden frames, rice paper screens, and tile roofing supported by bamboo elements, materials that provided adequate comfort and durability under normal circumstances, but created significant fire hazards when exposed to incendiary weapons designed specifically to exploit such vulnerabilities. 3 generations of the family lived together in the compact dwelling, sharing tatami mat rooms that served multiple purposes throughout each day, according to traditional practices that maximized the utility of limited space. Their neighborhood represented centuries of Japanese urban development, with narrow alleys connecting rows of similar homes occupied by working-class families whose roots in the area extended back through multiple generations, creating close-knit communities with strong social bonds and mutual support systems. Yoshiko had gradually grown accustomed to the occasional sound of air raid sirens during the previous months, though most alerts had resulted in minimal damage to their section of the city, as American bombing operations had typically focused on specific industrial facilities or military installations located in other areas. Previous strategic bombing attacks had generally occurred during daylight hours, with relatively small numbers of aircraft targeting identifiable military objectives, creating patterns that seemed predictable and manageable to civilian populations. The young mother's daily routine centered around caring for baby Hiroshi, while helping her mother Michiko manage household responsibilities that had become increasingly complicated by wartime shortages affecting all aspects of civilian life. Food rationing had become progressively more severe, requiring careful planning and preparation of meals that provided adequate nutrition, despite severely limited ingredients and unpredictable availability of basic necessities. Her father Jiro, a 62-year-old master craftsman who had spent his entire career producing precision instruments for both civilian and military applications, continued working despite his advancing age because younger men had been conscripted for military service throughout the Pacific Theater. His small workshop, located in a converted section of their home's ground floor, manufactured optical components and measuring devices that supported Japan's war production efforts through contracts with larger manufacturers. Like thousands of similar operations throughout the Shitamachi district, Jiro's facility represented the extensive shadow factory network that American intelligence agencies had identified as strategic targets that could only be eliminated through area bombing techniques. These small workshops were too numerous and dispersed to be targeted individually through precision bombing, but collectively they contributed significantly to Japan's military production capabilities. At 17:35 hours on March 9, 1945, Brigadier General Thomas Sarsfield Power of the 314th Bombardment Wing piloted the first B-29 Superfortress to lift off from Northfield, Guam, serving as mission commander for Operation Meetinghouse and beginning the most ambitious strategic bombing operation attempted during the Pacific War. The massive aircraft initially struggled against unusual weight distribution caused by maximum incendiary loads and reduced defensive armament. But Power's expert handling and extensive experience with B-29 operations gradually coaxed the bomber into a steady climb toward its cruising altitude. Behind General Power's lead aircraft, bomber after bomber followed at precisely calculated 50-second intervals from 3 separate island bases across the Mariana Islands chain, with timing coordination that reflected months of careful planning and logistical preparation. From Guam's multiple airfields, the 314th Bombardment Wing contributed the largest single force of participating aircraft, while simultaneously aircraft from the 73rd Bombardment Wing and 313th Bombardment Wing departed from Saipan's North Field and Isley Field. The departure sequence continued for over 4 hours as 334 B-29 bombers took off in carefully orchestrated succession, each aircraft loaded with identical configurations of 40 E-46 cluster bombs containing 38 M69 incendiary bomblets per cluster. This standardization represented approximately 1,520 individual fire-starting devices per bomber, creating unprecedented destructive potential when multiplied across the entire attacking force. Navigation equipment aboard each aircraft included the latest LORAN radio systems for long-range positioning, celestial navigation instruments for backup positioning when radio signals were unreliable, and detailed maps showing predetermined approach routes to Tokyo that had been carefully planned to minimize detection while ensuring coordinated arrival timing. Weather conditions during the departure phase proved optimal for the planned operation, with clear skies and minimal cloud cover, providing excellent visibility for takeoff procedures and initial navigation phases. The firestorm that engulfed Tokyo's Shitamachi district during the early morning hours of March 10, 1945, created environmental conditions unlike anything previously experienced in human warfare, transforming a densely populated urban area into an inferno that generated its own weather systems and created atmospheric disturbances that could be detected hundreds of miles away. Ground-level temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit liquefied asphalt streets, melted steel infrastructure, and created thermal conditions that made survival impossible for anyone caught within the affected area. The superheated air rising from thousands of simultaneous fires created powerful convection currents that produced wind velocities far exceeding the original meteorological conditions that had been considered optimal for fire propagation. These fire-generated winds reached speeds over 60 miles per hour in some locations, creating forces strong enough to lift adult human beings from the ground and transport burning debris for miles beyond the original target zone, spreading the destruction far beyond the boundaries that had been anticipated by mission planners. Within 15 minutes of the initial Pathfinder attacks, thousands of individual fires had erupted simultaneously across the entire Shitamachi district as M69 bomblets performed exactly as their designers had intended. The weapons penetrated through light roofing materials or detonated on ground surfaces before dispersing flaming napalm gel up to 100 feet in all directions, creating multiple ignition points that immediately began spreading to adjacent wooden structures through radiant heat transfer and direct contact with burning materials. Each successful bomblet created numerous separate ignition points that developed independently before merging with neighboring fires to create larger conflagrations, a process that occurred with such speed and coordination that firefighting efforts were overwhelmed before they could be effectively organized. The systematic nature of the destruction reflected the careful planning and weapon selection that had gone into Operation Meetinghouse. demonstrating that area incendiary attacks could achieve strategic results that exceeded the cumulative effects of months of precision bombing operations. The dawn of March 10, 1945, revealed the staggering magnitude of destruction that Operation Meetinghouse had inflicted upon Tokyo's Shitamachi district, as smoke cleared from still smouldering ruins to expose a landscape so thoroughly transformed that survivors could no longer recognize familiar landmarks that had provided orientation and identity for generations of residents. Recovery teams entering the affected area discovered only ash-covered ground, punctuated by concrete foundations and twisted metal remnants that had somehow survived the extreme heat generated by the firestorm. Official casualty counts presented enormous challenges due to the complete destruction of record-keeping facilities, the identification difficulties caused by extreme heat damage to human remains, and the displacement of survivors throughout the Tokyo metropolitan area and beyond. Multiple organizations attempted independent assessments using different methodologies and data sources, producing varying estimates that all confirmed casualties had exceeded any previous single military action against civilian populations. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department, working with surviving personnel and whatever equipment remained functional, reported 83,793 confirmed deaths and 40,918 wounded individuals requiring immediate medical treatment. However, police officials acknowledged that these figures represented only cases where positive identification had been possible and medical records were available, suggesting that actual casualties likely exceeded these documented numbers by significant margins. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducting comprehensive post-war analysis with access to both American operational records and Japanese government documentation, calculated 87,793 fatalities and 40,918 injuries directly attributable to Operation Meetinghouse. American analysts noted that their assessment methodology differed from Japanese approaches, and that casualty estimation in such circumstances remained inherently imprecise due to the destruction of normal documentation systems. Historical analysis conducted in subsequent decades by independent researchers generally concluded that total deaths exceeded 100,000 individuals, making Operation Meetinghouse more immediately deadly than either atomic bombing that would follow later in 1945. The precision of casualty figures remained impossible to determine due to the destruction of population records and the displacement of affected communities, but the magnitude clearly represented unprecedented civilian losses from a single military operation conducted over the course of several hours. Operation Meetinghouse achieved immediate strategic results that fundamentally transformed American bombing doctrine and significantly accelerated the timeline for achieving decisive victory in the Pacific War. Within 72 hours of assessing the destruction inflicted on Tokyo, senior American commanders recognized that area incendiary attacks offered unprecedented effectiveness compared to precision bombing methods that had consumed enormous resources while producing limited strategic impact against Japanese war production capabilities. General Curtis LeMay received authorization from the highest levels of military leadership to expand incendiary operations throughout Japan's urban areas, launching a systematic campaign that would ultimately target 67 Japanese cities before the war's conclusion in August 1945. The 21st Bomber Command immediately began preparations for similar operations against Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and other major population centers, containing concentrations of dispersed war production facilities that could only be eliminated through area bombing techniques. The tactical success of low-altitude night attacks using stripped-down B-29 bombers became standard operating procedure for all subsequent urban area operations throughout the remaining months of the Pacific War. The removal of defensive armament to maximize incendiary payloads proved so effective in achieving strategic objectives that this configuration was adopted permanently for strategic bombing missions, with aircraft weight reduction and improved fuel efficiency, enabling longer missions with heavier bomb loads while reducing mechanical stress on airframes and engines. Incendiary weapon production received immediate priority throughout American manufacturing facilities, as military planners and industrial leaders recognized the decisive potential of napalm-based area attacks for achieving strategic objectives that had previously required much larger resource commitments. Factories that had been producing conventional high-explosive bombs were rapidly converted to M69 bomblet manufacturing, with monthly incendiary production increasing from approximately 20,000 tons to over 50,000 tons by mid-1945. The strategic bombing campaign initiated by Operation Meetinghouse established precedents for urban warfare that extended far beyond the immediate context of the Pacific War, fundamentally altering international understanding of civilian vulnerability in modern conflicts, and providing strategic justification for targeting enemy populations as instruments of military policy. The acceptance of area attacks against residential neighborhoods marked a decisive shift from earlier doctrines that had emphasized distinction between military and civilian targets, creating frameworks that would influence military planning and international law for decades to come. The integration of scientific research with military operations reached unprecedented levels during the planning and execution of incendiary attacks against Japanese cities, demonstrating how civilian, academic, and industrial resources could be systematically mobilized to achieve military objectives. The Chemical Warfare Service had constructed detailed replicas of Japanese neighborhoods at Dugway Proving Ground, using authentic architectural plans, building materials, and construction techniques obtained through extensive intelligence operations, providing empirical data for optimizing incendiary effectiveness. Standard Oil Development Company's creation of napalm through extensive chemical research demonstrated how civilian industrial capacity could be rapidly mobilized to produce specialized military equipment designed for specific tactical requirements that had emerged from operational experience. The collaboration between petroleum companies, academic researchers, and military planners represented a model for integrating scientific expertise with strategic requirements that would influence post-war defense procurement and research policies throughout the Cold War period. Harvard University and the University of Chicago contributed analytical studies on fire propagation patterns, urban conflagration dynamics, and optimal weather conditions for incendiary attacks that provided theoretical foundations for operational planning and tactical implementation. This academic involvement in strategic bombing research established precedents for university participation in classified military research that would continue throughout the post-war period, creating ongoing relationships between civilian institutions and defense agencies. Operation Meetinghouse stands as a watershed moment in the evolution of warfare that fundamentally altered the relationship between military strategy and civilian populations, establishing precedents for strategic bombing that continue to influence international conflict more than 8 decades after that devastating night in Tokyo. The operation's immediate tactical success obscured profound moral and strategic questions about the deliberate targeting of civilian areas that remain relevant to contemporary discussions of warfare ethics and military necessity in an era of increasingly sophisticated weapons systems. The human cost of the operation transcended simple casualty statistics to encompass the complete destruction of communities, social networks, and cultural institutions that had provided identity and continuity for generations of Tokyo residents. Survivors like Yoshiko Hashimoto carried physical and psychological scars throughout their lives, while struggling to reconstruct not merely their personal circumstances, but their fundamental understanding of civilized conduct in modern warfare. The memory of that devastating night serves as both a testament to American military capabilities and technological superiority, and a sobering reminder of warfare's capacity for causing unprecedented human suffering, challenging each generation to consider how strategic objectives can be pursued while maintaining respect for human dignity and the fundamental principles that distinguish civilization from barbarism in the conduct of military operations. Operation Meetinghouse provides essential lessons about warfare conduct that remain relevant as new technologies continue expanding military capabilities, while global interconnection increases civilian vulnerability to distant conflicts, offering crucial insights into the challenges of maintaining ethical conduct while pursuing legitimate strategic objectives in an increasingly complex and dangerous world.